Sometimes the most broken souls find each other in the darkest moments. When all seems lost, the smallest act of kindness can change everything. In the frozen wasteland of 9th century Norway, Brandr One-Eye discovers a dying child buried in the snow. The giant Viking warrior expects to find a corpse, but instead finds a little girl clutching an ancient book, her eyes filled with secrets she cannot speak. She should be dead from the cold, yet something keeps her alive. Brandr has lived alone for years, carrying the weight of his past battles and losses. He has no family, no clan, no reason to care about a stranger's child. But when he looks into her frightened eyes, he sees something that reminds him of the daughter he lost long ago. Without a word, he lifts her into his massive arms and carries her home. Through the cruelest winter anyone can remember, these two lost souls will discover that survival isn't just about staying warm. It's about learning to trust again. What secret does this silent child carry that someone was willing to leave her, to die for? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled through the ancient pines like the voices of forgotten gods, carrying with it the bite of a winter that had already claimed more lives than the wars of 3 summers past. Deep in the Norwegian wilderness, where no roads led and few men dared to venture, Brandr One-Eye's cabin stood defiant against the storm, a fortress of weathered timber and iron will. Inside, warmth radiated from a stone hearth that had burned continuously for 7 days now, ever since he had carried the half-frozen child through his door. The flames cast dancing shadows across walls lined with the tools of survival. Fishing nets hung beside hunting spears, dried herbs bundled next to leather-working implements, and above it all, mounted on wooden pegs like a shrine to violence, hung his battle-worn axe. The weapon had tasted blood in a dozen kingdoms. Its iron head bore the nicks and scratches of countless encounters, each mark a story, each story a life taken or saved. The ash handle, smooth from years of gripping, had been carved with runes that spoke of honor and vengeance in equal measure. Now it gathered dust, while its owner tended to a child who weighed no more than a newborn calf. Brandr studied the girl as she slept on his bed, wrapped in every fur and woolen blanket he possessed. Her breathing had steadied during the night, no longer the desperate, rattling gasps that had terrified him when he first brought her inside. Her face, no longer blue-tinged with cold, revealed delicate features that spoke of noble blood, high cheekbones, a straight nose, skin too pale and unmarked for a peasant's daughter. She couldn't be more than 8 winters old, yet something in her dark eyes suggested she had seen more of the world's cruelty than most warriors twice her age. Even in sleep, her small hands clutched the leather satchel that had been frozen to her chest when he found her. Inside, he knew, were pages of an illuminated manuscript, vellum so fine it could only have come from a monastery or a jarl's hall, painted with gold leaf and pigments, worth more than most men earned in a lifetime. The memory of finding her remained vivid in his mind, like a fresh wound. He had been checking his trap lines near the abandoned longhouse that marked the northern boundary of his territory when he spotted what he first took to be a fallen log, half buried in the snow. Only when he drew closer did he realize it was a human form, small and still. His heart had clenched with familiar grief. How many times had he discovered such scenes during his years of warfare? How many children had he failed to save? But this one still drew breath. Brandr had lived alone in these woods for 3 years now, ever since the shame of his last campaign had driven him from civilized lands. He had chosen this isolation deliberately, seeking a place where his reputation couldn't follow, where the whispers about Brandr the kinslayer couldn't reach. Here, he answered to no jarl, served no king, owed allegiance to none but the rhythm of seasons and the demands of survival. His cabin reflected this solitary existence. Built with his own hands from timber he had felled and shaped, it contained only what one man needed: a bed, a table, shelves for his tools and supplies, hooks for his weapons and winter gear. There had been no thought of guests, no consideration. For children, no space for anything beyond the necessities of a warrior grown weary of war. Yet now his bed held a child, while he made do with a pile of furs beside the fire. His table bore a wooden bowl, carved hastily from birch, sized for small hands. His stores of dried meat and preserved vegetables, carefully rationed to last the winter for one man, were being shared without thought of tomorrow's hunger. The transformation puzzled him. Brandr had always prided himself on practical thinking, on making decisions based on cold calculation rather than emotion. It was this quality that had made him valuable to kings and jarls, who needed someone willing to do what others wouldn't. Yet here he was, risking his own survival for a child he knew nothing about, driven by an impulse he couldn't name or understand. Perhaps it was the way she had looked at him, in that first moment when her eyes fluttered open, not with fear, though. She had cause for it, but with a kind of resigned acceptance that broke something inside his chest. As if she had expected the world to be cruel and was grateful for any kindness, however small. Or perhaps it was the book. Brandr could read, a skill unusual among warriors, but necessary for one who had served in foreign courts and needed to understand treaties and battle plans. The fragments of text he had glimpsed spoke of philosophy and poetry, of concepts far beyond what a peasant child should know. The illustrations were masterful works depicting scenes from the old stories. Odin hanging from the world tree, Thor battling the serpent, the death of Balder the Beautiful. This was no ordinary child, and the book was no accident. During the long hours of her fevered sleep, Brandr had found himself remembering another time, another place. A small cabin much like this one, but filled with laughter instead of silence. A daughter with hair like spun gold who would curl beside him in the evenings while he told stories of distant lands and mighty deeds. Astrid had been her name, and she had loved tales of heroes and monsters with the fierce joy that only children possess. She would have been about this girl's age now, had she lived. The raiders had come in the night, as raiders always do. By the time Brandr returned from campaign, there was nothing left but ashes and graves. His wife, his daughter, his brother's family, all dead because he had been away playing at war for a king who forgot their names the moment the fighting ended. That was when the killing rage had taken him. That was when Brandr One-Eye had earned his darkest epithet. The raiders paid for their crime with their lives, yes, but so did others. Men who might have been innocent, villages that might have harbored the guilty, entire clans that might have given the killers shelter. In his grief and fury, Brandr had become the very thing he had once fought against, a bringer of meaningless death. The child stirred in his bed, murmuring something too soft to understand. Brandr moved to her side, checking the temperature of her forehead with the back of his weathered hand. The fever had broken completely now. Her skin was warm but no longer burning, her breathing deep and peaceful. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to hope she would survive. But survival would bring new challenges. She would wake soon, fully aware, and then what? She spoke no words he could understand, if she spoke at all. The few sounds she had made during her delirium seemed to be in some dialect he couldn't place, mixed with what might have been Frankish or even Latin. A child of noble birth, certainly, but from where? And why had she been left to die in the wilderness? The storm outside showed no signs of abating. Even if Brandr wanted to take her to the nearest settlement, and he wasn't certain he did, the mountain passes would be blocked for weeks yet. They were trapped here together, a battle-scarred giant and a mysterious child, with nothing but time and necessity to forge whatever understanding they could manage. He returned to his place by the fire, settling onto the pile of furs that served as his bed now. The flames hypnotized him with their endless dance, and he found his thoughts drifting to practical concerns. Food would be tight if the winter lasted much longer. He had planned his stores carefully for one person, and a growing child would need more than dried meat and root vegetables. There might be fish to catch through holes in the ice if the lake hadn't frozen completely. Small game could still be trapped if he was clever about it. These were problems he could solve. It was the larger questions that troubled him. The manuscript pages suggested education far beyond what most Jarls could provide for their children. The quality of the vellum and ink spoke of wealth and connection to learned men, perhaps monks from Ireland or scholars from Constantinople. Yet the child's clothes, though well made, were practical travelling garments rather than court finery. She had been prepared for a journey, not for display. A fugitive, then, but fleeing from what? And why would anyone abandon such a valuable hostage? For surely that's what she must be, in the wilderness, where her death would gain them nothing, unless her death was exactly what they wanted. The thought sent ice through his veins despite the warmth of the fire. If powerful men wanted this child dead, and if they discovered Brandr had saved her, then his quiet exile would come to a violent end. He had enemies enough already. He needed no new ones, especially not the kind who could afford illuminated manuscripts and had reasons to murder children. Yet as he watched her sleep, so small and helpless in his oversized bed, Brandr knew he had already made his choice. Whatever danger came, whatever price he would pay, he could not abandon her now. The ghosts of his past demanded this much, one child saved to balance the scales against all those he had failed to protect. Outside, the wind continued its ancient song of winter and want. Inside, the fire burned steady and warm, holding the darkness at bay for one more night. And in the bed that had known only solitude for 3 years, a little girl slept peacefully under the protection of a man who had forgotten how to be gentle, but was learning to remember. The word came soft as snowfall, but it struck Brandr like a war hammer to the chest. Papa. He froze beside the fire where he had been stirring a pot of thin broth, the wooden spoon suspended halfway to his mouth for tasting. The child, he still didn't know her name, sat upright in his bed for the first time since he had brought her. Inside 5 days ago, her dark eyes, clearer now than they had been since her fever broke, were fixed on his face with an intensity that made his breath catch. "Papa," she said again, and this time he heard the accent. Refined, educated, nothing like the harsh dialect of his own homeland. Yet the word itself was unmistakable, spoken in the old tongue that all Norse children learned at their mother's knee. Brandr set down the spoon, with hands that trembled despite all his efforts to still them. No one had called him that name since Astrid died. No one had the right to speak it, except the ghost of the golden-haired daughter who visited his dreams and made him wake with tears on his cheeks. "I am not your papa, little one," he said gently, though the words felt like stones in his throat. "Your papa is—" He stopped, uncertainty flooding through him. Where was her father? What had happened to the man who should have protected this? A child? She tilted her head to one side, studying him with those ancient eyes that seemed far too knowing for her young face. Then she smiled, the first smile he had seen from her, and spoke a longer phrase in that same refined accent, too rapid for him to follow completely. But he caught enough words to understand the meaning. She was thanking him for taking care of her. The trust in that smile, the gratitude in her voice, nearly undid him. Brandr had to turn away, busying himself with ladling broth into the small wooden bowl he had carved for her. His vision blurred momentarily, and he blinked hard to clear it. Warriors didn't weep over children's words, no matter how they might pierce the heart. When he turned back with the bowl, she had shifted position, sitting cross-legged on the bed with the leather satchel open in her lap. The manuscript pages were spread around her like fallen leaves, and she was pointing to one of the illuminated letters while speaking in that rapid, musical language. Brandr approached slowly, as he might approach a wounded animal that could bolt. At any sudden movement, he held out the bowl, and she accepted it with both hands, nodding her thanks before taking a careful sip. The broth was thin, mostly water flavored with herbs and small bits of preserved meat, but she drank as if it were the finest wine. While she ate, he studied the pages more closely than he had dared before. The text was Latin, he realized now. Not the church Latin he knew from dealing with priests and monks, but something older, more classical. Mixed with it were verses in Greek and what might have been Arabic numerals. This was scholarship of the highest order, the kind of learning that existed only in the greatest libraries of Constantinople or Cordoba. One page caught his attention, not for its text, but for the illustration that dominated the upper half. It showed a great hall filled with warriors, seated at long tables, while at the head table sat a figure wearing a golden crown. The king's face was rendered with such skill that individual features were clearly visible. A strong jaw, intelligent eyes, a carefully groomed beard streaked with silver. Brandr's blood turned to ice water in his veins. He knew that face. Every warrior who had served in the eastern campaigns knew it. Jarl Gunnar the Wise, ruler of the richest holdings in all Norway, keeper of the old laws, patron of scholars and poets. A man whose word was law from the Sonnefjord to the Swedish borders, whose wealth rivaled that of kings, whose political connections stretched across the known world. And if this manuscript belonged to Jarl Gunnar's household, then this child, Brandr, looked at her again, seeing for the first time what he should have noticed immediately. The shape of her face, the set of her eyes, the way she held herself even while eating, all of it marked her as nobility. Not just any nobleman's daughter, but daughter to one of the most powerful men in the north. Adis, he whispered, remembering. Now the stories he had heard in ale halls and around campaign fires. Jarl Gunnar's only child, born late in his life to a wife who died bringing her into the world. The apple of her father's eye, said to be brilliant beyond her years, already reading and writing when most children were still learning to walk without falling. The girl, Adis, looked up at the sound of her name, and the recognition in her eyes confirmed his guess. She spoke rapidly again, and this time he caught more of the meaning. She was asking about her father, wanting to know if he was coming, if he was safe. Brandr's mind raced through the implications. If Adis was here, alone and nearly dead in the wilderness, what had happened to Jarl Gunnar? The man commanded a personal guard of 50 sworn warriors, lived in a hall that was more fortress than home, and never travelled without an escort that could have stopped a small army. For his daughter to be abandoned in the snow suggested catastrophe on an unimaginable scale. Political assassination. The words formed in his mind like a curse. Someone had moved against Gunnar, and they had moved decisively enough to scatter his entire household. But who would dare, and why leave the child alive, even briefly? As if sensing his growing alarm, Adis reached into her satchel and withdrew something he hadn't noticed before. A small bundle wrapped in oiled cloth. With careful fingers, she unwrapped it to reveal documents bearing official seals, correspondence, written in multiple hands, and at the bottom of the pile, a ring that made Brandr's heart stop. The seal ring of Jarl Gunnar, carved with the ancient bear symbol of his house and set with a ruby the size of a robin's egg. No Jarl would willingly part with such a thing. It was literally the symbol of his authority, the mark that made his word binding across all his lands. If Adis possessed it, then Gunnar was dead. The child seemed to understand his shock, for she began speaking again, more slowly this time, using simple words he could follow. Between her broken phrases and his growing comprehension, a terrible story emerged. Men coming in the night, fighting in the great hall, her father falling. Someone. She touched her throat and made a cutting gesture, trying to silence her permanently. But she had escaped somehow, with the help of a servant who paid for the kindness with his own life. She had run into the night, carrying nothing but this satchel and its precious contents, and she had kept running until the cold claimed her strength and left her to die in the snow. How long? Brandr asked in the old tongue, holding up fingers to indicate days. How many days running? She considered, then held up both hands twice. 20 days, if he understood correctly. 20 days of a child traveling alone through the wilderness in the harshest winter anyone could remember. It was a miracle she had survived even that long. But 20 days also meant her father's enemies had time to consolidate their power, time to spread whatever story they chose about what had happened to Jarl Gunnar and his daughter. By now they might well control his entire realm, and anyone who knew the truth would be dead or fled. Anyone except the child sitting on his bed, eating his broth, and looking at him with eyes that held both infinite trust and bottomless grief. Brandr sank onto his stool beside the fire, his mind reeling. He had lived as an outcast for 3 years, wanting nothing more than to be left alone with his guilt and his memories. Now he found himself guardian to the most valuable and most hunted child in all the Northlands. Men would kill for the chance to possess her or to ensure she never reached adulthood to claim her inheritance. Keeping her was madness. It meant abandoning any hope of continued peace, accepting that his exile was over and that violence would find him again whether he sought it or not. It meant becoming a target for forces that could muster armies against him, but the alternative was unthinkable. He looked at Adis again, this small girl who had called him Papa with such innocent trust, and felt something shift inside his chest. A door long locked, swinging open, admitting light into chambers that had known only darkness. "Adis," he said softly, and she looked up with those knowing eyes. "Your Papa." He touched his chest, then pointed to her. "Your Papa is gone. But I—" He struggled for words in the old tongue that would make her understand. "I will keep you safe, I promise." She studied his face for a long moment, as if weighing his words against some internal measure of truth. Then she nodded once, firmly, and returned to her broth. Outside, the wind continued its endless song, but now it seemed to carry new voices. The sound of pursuit, drawing ever closer to their small sanctuary in the woods. The wooden doll took shape slowly under Brandr's careful knife, each cut deliberate and precise. He had worked with wood before. Every warrior knew how to repair weapons and tools, but never with such attention to detail, never with such concern for the final result bringing joy rather than function. Adis sat cross-legged on a fur beside the fire, watching his hands with fascination as he carved. She'd grown stronger each day since her identity had been revealed, though she still tired easily and spoke only when necessary. The trauma of her father's death and her desperate flight lived in her silence. But Brandr could see small signs of healing beginning to emerge. "The nose is the hardest part," he explained, though he wasn't certain she understood all his words. "Too little and she looks like a skull. Too much and she looks like a troll." He held up the half-finished figure for her inspection. "What do you think?" Adis leaned forward, studying the doll with the same intense concentration she brought to everything. After a moment, she reached out and touched the wooden face gently, then made a small adjustment gesture with her finger. Just a tiny bit. "Less prominent." Brandr nodded and resumed carving, shaving off thin curls of birch that fell to the floor like snow. The simple act of creating something beautiful instead of deadly felt strange after so many years of violence, but it also felt right in a way he couldn't explain. Perhaps this was what peace looked like, a man by his fire, making toys for a child, while winter raged harmlessly outside. They had fallen into routines during the week since her fever broke. Each morning, Brandr would check his traps and gather firewood, while Adis remained safely inside, wrapped in furs and sipping warm broth. He had taught her the signals. 3 sharp knocks meant all was well, 2 meant possible danger, 1 meant immediate hiding was necessary. She learned quickly, this Jarl's daughter. Within days, she could identify the sounds that meant safety versus those that suggested threat. She knew which hiding spots in the cabin offered the best concealment, and how to muffle her breathing if searchers came near. But it wasn't all lessons in survival and fear. In the afternoons, when the light was best, Adis would show him her manuscript pages while he worked on equipment maintenance or food preparation. She would point to words and images, speaking their names in her musical accent, while he supplied the corresponding terms in his rougher dialect. Horse, she would say, pointing to an illustration of riders. Hest, he would reply, and she would repeat it carefully, rolling the unfamiliar sounds around her mouth like a new food. Sword, he would say, touching his own weapon. Gladius, she would respond, using the Latin term, and then add what must have been the same word in her father's tongue. Through these exchanges, Brandr began to understand that Idis spoke at least 4 languages: the refined Norse of the courts, Latin from her scholarly education, something that might have been Irish or Welsh, and what he gradually realized was Arabic. Jarl Gunnar had clearly intended his daughter to be a diplomat, as well as a ruler, capable of negotiating with anyone from Constantinople to Cordoba. Such an education made her incredibly valuable and incredibly dangerous to whoever had seized her father's lands. The doll's features were nearly complete now. Brandr had given her a kind face, with eyes that seemed almost alive in the firelight, and a slight smile that suggested secrets worth sharing. For hair, he had carved fine lines that could represent any color the imagination desired. "She needs a name," he said, holding up the finished work. Adis considered this seriously, tilting her head as she examined the doll from different angles. Finally, she spoke a single word: Astrid. The name hit Brandr like a physical blow. He stared at the child, wondering if she could possibly know. But no, how could she? It was simply coincidence, the cruel humor of the gods, that she would choose his dead daughter's name for her first toy. "Astrid is a good name," he managed to say, his voice steadier than he felt. "A strong name for a brave doll." Adis accepted, the wooden figure with both hands, cradling it against her chest as if it were made of gold instead of carved birch. For the first time since he had found her, she smiled, not the polite expression of gratitude she had shown before, but the spontaneous joy of a child receiving an unexpected gift. That smile transformed her entire face, revealing the girl she might have been if tragedy hadn't touched her life so early. In that moment, Brandr could see glimpses of the child who had once run laughing through her father's hall, who had pestered scholars for more stories, who had believed the world was full of wonders waiting to be discovered. "Thank you, Papa," she whispered in the old tongue, and this time Brandr didn't correct her. They shared their evening meal in comfortable silence, Adis periodically checking to make sure her doll was still beside her on the furs. Brandr had managed to catch 2 fish through a hole in the ice that morning, and the fresh protein was clearly doing her good. Color had returned to her cheeks, and she no longer looked like a ghost haunting his cabin. As darkness fell and the fire settled into its nighttime rhythm, Brandr began one of the old stories, the tale of how Odin had traded his eye for wisdom. Adis listened with rapt attention, occasionally asking questions in her mixture of languages. She wanted to know why the god had thought the bargain fair, whether wisdom was always worth suffering, and what had happened to the eye afterward. Her questions revealed a mind trained in philosophical thinking far beyond her years. Jarl Gunnar had clearly spared no expense in her education, bringing scholars from across the known world to teach his precious daughter. The thought of such a brilliant mind being snuffed out by political ambition filled Brandr with rage that he carefully kept hidden. When the story ended, Idis settled into her nest of furs, with the wooden Astrid clutched in her arms. But instead of immediately falling asleep, as had become her custom, she spoke quietly into the firelit darkness. "My papa told me stories too," she said in careful Norse, "about brave warriors who protected people who couldn't protect themselves." Brandr felt his throat tighten. "Did he?" He said that the greatest warriors weren't the ones who won the most battles, but the ones who knew when to fight and when to show mercy. She was quiet for a moment, then added, "He said that protecting the innocent was the highest honor a warrior could achieve." The wisdom of Jarl Gunnar the Wise passed down to his daughter in bedtime stories. No wonder the man had been beloved by his people and feared by his enemies. He had understood something that many warriors never learned, that true strength lay not in the ability to destroy, but in choosing when and how to use that ability. "Your father was a wise man," Brandr said softly. "Yes," Adis agreed, "and he would have liked you." Those simple words carried more weight than any praise from kings or jarls. A child's instinctive trust filtered through the memory of a good father's teachings. Brandr found himself blinking back tears for the second time that day. Outside, snow began to fall again, the flakes visible through the single window like a curtain of stars. Somewhere in that darkness, he knew, men were searching. Professional hunters, patient and methodical, following tracks that the recent storms might have covered but would not have erased entirely. They would find this place eventually. It was inevitable as sunrise, as certain as winter's bite. Winter, they came. Brandr would be ready, not just with weapons and tactics, but with the knowledge that he was protecting something precious beyond measure, a child's innocence, a father's love, the hope that goodness could still exist in a world that often seemed ruled by cruelty and greed. For now, though, there was peace. A wooden doll named Astrid, warm furs, and the gentle breathing of a little girl who had learned to trust again, despite every reason not to. It was enough. For now, it was everything. The drawings appeared like memories made visible, scratched into the dirt floor beside the fire where Idis sat with her wooden doll. At first, Brandr thought she was simply playing, but as he watched her small finger trace deliberate lines in the ash and dust, he realized she was creating something far more meaningful. A great hall, long tables filled with warriors, a figure at the head table wearing what could only be a crown. "Papa's hall," she said softly. When she noticed his attention, using the mixture of Norse and her father's dialect that had become their common language. "This is where we lived." Brandr knelt beside her, studying the crude but surprisingly detailed sketch. She had captured not just the basic layout, but specific elements that spoke to someone who had lived there. The placement of the high seat, the arrangement of the fire pits, even what looked like tapestries hanging on the walls. "It was beautiful," he said, and meant it. From her simple drawing, he could envision the wealth and power that had been Jarl Gunnar's, not just material riches, but the kind of ordered prosperity that came from wise leadership and careful planning. Adis nodded, then began a new drawing. Beside the first, this one showed figures approaching the hall, many figures with weapons in their hands. Her movements became more agitated as she drew, and Brandr saw her jaw clench with remembered fear. "The bad men," she whispered. "They came at night when Papa thought it was safe." She continued drawing, her small finger moving faster now, creating a chaotic scene of violence and destruction, bodies on the floor, smoke rising from burning buildings, and at the center of it all, a small figure running, clutching something to her chest. "Uncle Tormund said he would protect me," she continued, adding details to her drawing that made Brandr's blood run cold. "But then she stopped, staring at the dirt images as if seeing the real events play out again. "Uncle Tormund," Brandr repeated carefully. He knew that name, knew it well. Tormund Ironhand, called the Oathkeeper, Jarl Gunnar's younger brother and most trusted advisor. A man whose reputation for honor was matched only by his skill in battle. If Tormund had been involved in the attack, "He was supposed to keep me safe," Adis said, her voice small and confused. "Papa always said Uncle Tormund would protect our family if anything happened. But that night She made a cutting gesture across her throat, the same one she had made when first telling him about her father's death. The implications crashed over Brandr like a collapsing mountain. Not an outside attack then, not foreign enemies or rival jarls seeking to expand their territory. This had been betrayal from within, brother against brother, the worst kind of treachery the old laws recognized. But why would Tormund move against his own blood? Jarl Gunnar had no sons, which meant Adis was his only heir. Traditional law would pass leadership to her closest male relative until she came of age, which would be Tormund himself. Why risk everything in a violent coup when patience would have given him the same result legitimately, unless he never intended for Adis to reach adulthood? The thought sent ice through Brandr's veins. A regent could rule in a child's name for years, decades even, and many things could happen to young heirs during that time. Accidents were common, illnesses struck without warning, and who would question the tragic death of an orphaned girl already weakened by the loss of her father? "Show me more," he said gently. "Show me how you escaped." Adis hesitated, then began a new series of drawings. A servant, she drew him with careful detail, including what looked like a limp that suggested an old injury. The man helping her through a window, running through darkness, the servant falling with arrows in his back while she continued to flee. "Old. Eric," she whispered. "He took care of Papa's horses. He said there was a place we could hide, but the bad men followed us." Tears began to track down her cheeks as she drew the final image. Herself alone in the wilderness, the loyal servant's sacrifice having bought her just enough time to disappear into the night. "Eric was brave," Brandr said, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "He saved you because he knew you were worth saving," she nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Then, with sudden determination, she began to smooth away the drawings, erasing the painful memories from the dirt floor. When she was finished, she looked up at him with eyes that held both sorrow and resolve. "Will you teach me to be strong like Eric?" she asked. "Like Papa, like you?" The question pierced him more deeply than any blade. Here was a child who had lost everything, who had witnessed horrors that would break many adults, asking not for comfort or protection, but for the tools to protect herself. The courage in that request humbled him. "Yes," he said simply, "but first, let me show you something." Brandr rose and went to the wall where his tools hung in careful order. His fingers found what he was looking for, a loose stone that had always bothered him, but which he had never bothered to fix properly. He worked at it for a moment, and the stone came free, revealing a small cavity behind it. Inside was a rolled piece of bark covered with scratched marks that formed a crude map. "These mountains have been home to outlaws and refugees for centuries," he explained, unrolling the bark carefully. "The old kings used to hunt rebels through these passes, so the hunted learned to create escape routes that only they knew about." The map showed a network of caves, hidden paths, and emergency supply caches that stretched deep into the most inaccessible parts of the mountain range. Some of the markings were so old they had been carved by men whose grandfathers were dust, but others looked more recent, including some that Brandr recognized as his own additions from his years of solitary exploration. "This place," he pointed to a mark that indicated his cabin, "sits right in the middle of the old escape routes. That's why I chose it. If I ever needed to disappear completely, I could follow these paths to places where no army could follow." Adis studied the map with the same intensity she brought to her manuscript pages. "Could we disappear?" she asked. "If the bad men come." "We could," Brandr admitted. "But running isn't always the answer. Sometimes you have to stand and fight for what matters." He looked at her seriously. "The question is, what matters most to you? Staying alive or making sure your uncle can't hurt anyone else the way he hurt your father?" It was a heavy question to pose to a child, but Adis had already proven she was no ordinary child. She deserved the truth, and she deserved the chance to help decide her own fate. She was quiet for a long time, holding her wooden doll and staring at the runestone map. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the shutters and reminding them both that winter still held the land in its grip. Finally, she spoke. "Papa always said that good people have to stop bad people, or the bad people win forever." She looked up at him with those ancient eyes. "I want to stop Uncle Tormund. I want him to pay for what he did to Papa and Eric and all the others." Brandr nodded slowly. He had expected no less from Gunnar, the Wise's daughter, but hearing the resolve in her young voice still sent a chill down his spine. not fear, but anticipation. The prey was choosing to become the hunter. Then we'll need to be very careful, he said, and very smart. Your uncle isn't just strong, he's clever too, but we have advantages he doesn't know about. What advantages? Brandr smiled grimly. He thinks you're dead, and he has no idea that Brandr One-Eye is still alive and very, very angry. Outside, something moved in the darkness beyond the window. Just a shadow against shadows, but enough to make Brandr's warrior instincts flare to full alertness. Their time of peace was ending. The hunt was about to begin. The pendant caught the firelight like a trapped star, its silver surface gleaming with an inner radiance that seemed almost alive. Idis held it reverently in her small hands, having retrieved it from a hidden pocket sewn into the lining of her travel clothes, a pocket so cunningly concealed that even Brandr's careful examination had missed it. "Mama's pendant," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Papa said I should only show it to people who could help us." Brandr's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the intricate knotwork design etched into the silver disc. The pattern was unmistakable. The intertwined wolves of Clan Eriksson, one of the most powerful and honorable houses in all the northern kingdoms. But more than that, he recognized the specific variations in the design that marked this as belonging to the clan's main line, the family that had ruled their territories with wisdom and strength for 7 generations. "Your mother was Sigrid. Eriksdottir," he said, not quite a question. The memories came flooding back, stories told around countless fires, songs sung in a dozen mead halls. The legendary beauty who had caught the eye of every eligible jarl in the north. The brilliant woman who had chosen Gunnar the Wise over kings and princes. The tragic figure who had died bringing her only child into the world. "You knew her?" Adis asked, hope flickering in her dark eyes. "I knew of her," Brandr replied carefully. "Every warrior who served in the eastern campaigns heard tales of Sigrid the Fair. They said she was not only beautiful but wise beyond her years, that she could speak 7 languages and had read every book in the great library of Constantinople." He paused, studying the pendant more closely. "But more importantly, her family has a reputation for keeping their oaths, even when it costs them dearly." The implications of the pendant's existence began to unfold in his mind like a tactical map. If Adis carried proof of her maternal lineage, if Clan Eriksson could be convinced to acknowledge their kinship, then she wasn't just a fugitive child with a claim to her murdered father's lands. She was bloodkin to one of the most respected families in the north, with legitimate grounds to seek their protection and support. "Tell me about your mother's family," he said, settling beside the fire where he could watch both Idis and the approaches to the cabin. His warrior's instincts had been growing more urgent all day, sensing pursuit, drawing closer with each passing hour. Adis clutched the pendant tighter, as if drawing strength from the connection to her lost mother. "Grandfather Erik died before I was born, but Papa used to tell me stories about him. He said grandfather was the most honorable man he ever knew, that his word was worth more than gold, because once given, it could never be broken." "I heard those same stories," Brandr confirmed. "Erik the Oathkeeper, they called him. When the plague swept through the coastal settlements 15 years ago, he opened his own halls to refugees, even though his advisors warned it might bring disease to his people. Half his household died, including his eldest son, but he never turned away a single family seeking shelter. Papa said that's why Mama loved him so much. She said honor was more important than safety, and that a leader who wouldn't risk everything to protect the innocent didn't deserve to lead anyone." Adis's voice carried the cadence of oft-repeated lessons, a father's wisdom passed down to his daughter through countless bedtime conversations. The sound of branches snapping outside brought Brandr to instant alertness. He held up one finger, the signal for silence, and moved quietly to the window. Through a gap in the shutters, he could see movement in the tree line, shadows that didn't belong to wind-blown branches or shifting snow. They had been found. He returned to Adis, who sat frozen with the pendant still clutched in her hands, her eyes wide with understanding. She had learned to read his expressions over their weeks together, and she knew what his tension meant. "How many?" she whispered, so quietly he had to lean close to hear. "At least 3, probably more," he replied in the same barely audible tone. "They're being careful, professional, not bandits or raiders, trained men." Adis nodded, her face pale but determined. Without being told, she began gathering her few possessions, the manuscript pages, the documents from her father's study, and now the precious pendant. Everything disappeared into the leather satchel. With practiced efficiency, Brandr moved to his weapon rack, selecting his long seax and a shorter backup blade. The battle axe that hung above the hearth would be too unwieldy in the confines of the cabin, better saved for open combat if it came to that. He had hoped for more time, more opportunities to plan and prepare, but war had its own schedule that cared nothing for personal preference. "The tunnel," he said, nodding toward the back corner of the cabin, where a carefully concealed opening led to an escape route he had prepared during his first winter in these mountains. "Follow it to the 3rd branching, then take the left path. It will bring you out near the waterfall, where you can follow the stream down to the old shepherd's cave." "What about you?" Adis asked, though her expression suggested she already knew the answer. "I'll buy you time to escape, then follow when I can." It was a lie, and they both knew it. The pursuers would expect him to run, would be prepared for a chase through the mountains. What they wouldn't expect was a direct assault from a man who had spent 3 decades perfecting the art of violence. Adis stood abruptly, the pendant still gleaming in her hand. Instead of heading toward the escape tunnel, she moved to where Brandr knelt, checking his weapons. "Mama's family has a winter. Lodge 3 days' ride north of here," she said urgently, "hidden in the high passes where they used to hunt elk with the old king. If I can reach them, if I can show them this pendant and tell them what happened to Papa, they might help." Brandr finished. "Yes, I think they would. Clan Eriksson has no love for men who break oaths or murder kinfolk. Then don't fight them." "Here," Adis pleaded, "come with me. We'll find grandfather's people together, and then we'll have an army to face Uncle Tormund properly." Brandr looked into her eyes, so young, yet filled with such determination, and felt his resolve waver. The tactical part of his mind knew she was right. A fighting retreat would preserve their options, keep them alive to gather allies and plan. A proper response. But the warrior in him, the part that had been shaped by 30 years of violence and loss, hungered for immediate action. 3 days through mountain passes in winter," he said, "pursued by professional trackers. The odds are better than facing them here with nowhere to run." Adis interrupted with logic beyond her years. "Papa always said that courage wasn't about fighting when you were cornered. It was about knowing when to fight and when to be smart. The wisdom of Gunnar the Wise, spoken through the lips of his 8-year-old daughter." Brandr found himself smiling despite the circumstances. "Your father was indeed a wise man," he said. "Very well, we run for now. But I promise you this. When we do turn to fight, it will be with every advantage we can gather." Outside, the shadows were moving closer, circling the cabin with predatory patience. But inside, by the dying light of the fire, a new plan was taking shape. Not the desperate flight of hunted fugitives, but the strategic withdrawal of players in a larger game. "Clan Eriksson," Brandr murmured, testing the name like a weapon being balanced in his hand. Yes, that could change everything. The pendant seemed to pulse within a fire, as if Sigrid the Fair herself approved of their decision. In 3 days, if they could survive the journey, Idis would no longer be alone in the world, and Tormund Ironhand would discover that killing his brother had made him far more enemies than he ever imagined. The emergency winter shelter kit lay spread across the snow like the bones of some ancient beast, each piece precisely placed according to knowledge earned through decades of survival. In hostile territory, Brandr worked with methodical efficiency, despite the howling wind that threatened to tear the materials from his hands, while Adis crouched nearby, holding components steady with her small but determined grip. "The support poles first," he explained, his voice barely audible above the storm. "Always build from the foundation up, never try to work from the outside in." They had been traveling for 2 days since fleeing the cabin, following game trails and hidden paths that existed more in Brandr's memory than on any map. The professional trackers had followed them with relentless skill, never quite close enough to force a confrontation, but never far enough away to allow true rest. The storm that now lashed the mountainside was both blessing and curse. It would hide their tracks and shelter, but it also made travel treacherous and survival a constant battle against the elements. Adis handed him the next pole with hands that trembled only slightly from cold. Her endurance continued to amaze him. Where grown warriors might have collapsed from exhaustion or despair, she pressed forward with quiet determination, never complaining about the harsh conditions or the meager rations they shared. "Like this?" she asked, holding a support rope at the angle he had demonstrated. "Perfect. You learn quickly." Brandr secured the rope with a knot that would hold against any wind the mountains could summon. "Your father taught you well. Not just books and languages, but how to think clearly when everything around you is chaos." The compliment brought a small smile to her frost-reddened face. Over their days of travel, she had begun to speak more freely, sharing memories of her life before the tragedy that had destroyed her world. Through her stories, Brandr had come to understand just how remarkable Jarl Gunnar's household had been. Not just wealthy and powerful, but genuinely dedicated to learning and justice. Papa used to say that a leader's greatest tool wasn't a sword or a crown, but the ability to remain calm when everyone else was panicking, Adis said, helping him stretch the hide covering over their makeshift frame. He said fear made people stupid, but clear thinking could solve almost any problem. Wise words. Brandr pulled the covering tight, creating a space just large enough for both of them to lie down with their supplies. It wasn't comfortable, but it would keep them alive. Through the night, I've seen men with superior numbers and better weapons lose battles because they let fear cloud their judgment. Once the shelter was complete, they crawled inside with their packs and the small oil lamp that would provide just enough warmth to prevent frostbite. The space was cramped, barely large enough for an adult and child to share, but after 2 days of exposure to wind and snow, it felt like luxury. Adis settled beside him, still clutching her wooden doll, despite all the hardships of their journey. The toy had become more than a simple plaything. It was her anchor to better times, a reminder that kindness and care still existed in a world that seemed determined to crush all gentle things. "Tell me about Clan Eriksson," she said as Brandr distributed their evening meal, strips of dried meat and hard cheese that tasted like paradise after a day of hiking through knee-deep snow. "Your mother's people are known for 3 things," Brandr replied, settling into what had become their evening ritual of shared stories and planning. "Honor, courage, and long memories. They never forget a kindness, but they also never forget an injury. If they accept you as kin, they'll defend you to their last breath. And if they don't," Brandr considered this honestly, "then we'll face that challenge when it comes. But I knew your grandfather's reputation, and I remember your mother's. Clan Eriksson values justice above all else, and what your uncle did, brother murdering brother, child left to die in the wilderness, that goes against everything they hold sacred." Adis nodded thoughtfully, then asked the question that had been haunting both of them. What if Uncle Tormund's men find us before we reach them? It was a practical concern that couldn't be ignored. Their pursuers had proven remarkably skilled at tracking, following their trail through conditions that should have made pursuit impossible. Someone was providing them with information, either a tracker of extraordinary ability or someone with knowledge of these mountains that rivaled Brandr's own. "Then we fight," he said simply. But we fight smart, not desperate. We choose the ground, the timing, the terms of engagement. He looked at her seriously. Are you ready for that? Really ready? Because when the time comes, there won't be room for hesitation or mercy. Adis was quiet for a long moment, staring at the small flame of their lamp, as if seeing futures written in its dancing light. When she spoke, her voice carried a hardness that belonged to someone far older than her 8 years. Uncle Tormund killed my father in front of me. He ordered men to cut my throat like I was a sheep for slaughter. He destroyed everything good and safe in my world. She looked up at Brandr with eyes that held depths of resolve he recognized from his own mirror. When the time comes to fight, I'll be ready. The words should have troubled him, a child speaking of violence with such calm determination. Instead, he felt a fierce pride in her strength. She wasn't seeking revenge from spite or anger, but justice from principle. The difference mattered, especially in someone who might one day rule others. Good, he said. But remember, we're not trying to become like your uncle. We're trying to stop him from hurting anyone else. That distinction will matter when the fighting starts. Outside their small shelter, the wind continued its relentless assault on the mountain, but inside they were warm and safe. Adis curled up with her doll, while Brandr maintained watch through the small gap they had left in the shelter wall. His warrior's instincts remained alert, even as his body craved rest. Tomorrow would bring them within sight of Clan Ericsson's territory, if his memory of these peaks proved accurate. One more day of travel through treacherous conditions. One more night of evading their pursuers, and they would either find sanctuary or face their final battle in the high passes where only eagles and outlaws dared to go. Brandr. Adis's voice was sleepy but concerned. Yes? Thank you for not leaving me, for choosing to help me even when it put you in danger. He reached over and gently touched her shoulder. Thank you for giving an old warrior a reason to believe. In honor again. She smiled at that and closed her eyes, trusting him to keep watch while she slept. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering their tracks and hiding their presence from any who might follow. But somewhere in the darkness, Brandr. New, patient men were still hunting, men who would kill them both without hesitation if given the chance. The race for sanctuary had become a matter of hours rather than days. Tomorrow would decide everything. The mountain pass opened before them like a gateway to salvation, its snow-covered slopes gleaming in the pale morning light. Beyond the narrow defile, Brandr could see the smoke of distant hearthfires rising from what must be one of Clan Ericsson's border settlements. They had made it. 3 days of desperate flight through some of the most treacherous terrain in the north, and they had actually reached safety. Adis stood beside him at the edge of the tree line, her small hand shading her eyes as she peered toward the settlement. The wooden doll named Astrid was tucked securely in her arms, and her mother's silver pendant caught the sunlight like a beacon of hope beneath her travel-worn cloak. We made it, she whispered, and for the first time since he had found her dying in the snow, she sounded like the child she truly was, excited, relieved, ready to believe that good things could still happen. Yes, Brandr agreed, though something nagged at his warrior's instincts. The settlement ahead looked prosperous and peaceful, exactly what they had hoped to find. But the approaches to the pass were too clear, too unguarded for a border position in hostile territory. But we go carefully. Even among friends, it's wise to... The sound of steel being drawn from leather brought him instantly to full alertness, not from ahead, where he might have expected border guards to challenge them, but from behind, where the narrow trail they had followed emerged from the deep forest. I was wondering when you would finally notice my approach. The voice hit Brandr like a physical blow, familiar as his own heartbeat, warm with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to command. He turned slowly, hardly daring to believe what his ears had told him, and found himself staring at a figure that belonged in his nightmares rather than the waking world. Tormund Ironhand stood 20 paces away, flanked by a dozen warriors in winter gear, his distinctive battle axe held casually in his right hand. He looked exactly as Brandr remembered from their campaigns together, tall and broad-shouldered, with iron-grey hair braided in the old style and intelligent blue eyes that missed nothing. The years had been kind to him. He moved with the fluid grace of a man in his prime, and his smile held all the warmth that had once made him Brandr's closest friend. "Hello, old friend," Tormund said, his tone conversational despite the drawn weapons of his escort. "You look well, considering the stories I've been hearing about your death these past 3 years." Adis pressed close to Brandr's side, her face pale with recognition and terror. She had seen this man before, not as the loving uncle who had dandled her on his knee and told her stories, but as the cold-eyed killer who had orchestrated her father's murder. "Tormund!" Brandr's hand moved instinctively toward his seax, but stopped at a slight shake of his old friend's head. Too many weapons pointed at them, too little cover, too much open ground between them and safety. "I should have known you would be leading the hunt personally. Did you really think I would trust this task to subordinates?" Tormund's smile widened, but it never reached his eyes. "When word reached me that someone had found my dear little niece, when the descriptions matched a certain one-eyed giant, who was supposed to be mouldering in an unmarked grave somewhere, well, I simply had to come see for myself." "Uncle Tormund," Idis whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why? Why did you kill Papa?" The question hung in the cold air like an accusation, and for just a moment, Tormund's expression softened with what might have been genuine regret. When he looked at Idis, Brandr could see echoes of the man who had once been known throughout the north as Tormund the Oathkeeper, whose word was considered more reliable than the sunrise. "Oh, little raven," Tormund said, using the pet name. He had called her since childhood. "You're too young to understand the choices that leaders sometimes have to make. Your father was going to destroy everything our family had built. His weakness, his obsession with justice and honor, he would have led our people to ruin. So you decided to lead them yourself," Brandr said, understanding flooding through him like ice water. "This was never about inheritance or succession. This was about philosophy, about what kind of ruler the people needed." Tormund nodded approvingly, as if pleased that his old battle brother had grasped the situation so quickly. Gunnar lived in the past, trying to rule by codes written when the world was different. He actually believed that honor mattered more than results, that keeping your word was more important than keeping your people alive. His voice took on the passionate intensity of a true believer. "The southern kingdoms are rising, Brandr. The Franks, the Saxons, the damned Christ worshippers, with their new ways of war. We needed a leader who understood that survival requires pragmatism, not noble gestures. And murdering children." Brandr gestured toward Adis. "How does that serve your people's survival?" For the first time, Tormund's composure cracked slightly. "She's Gunnar's daughter. As long as she lives, there will always be those who remember the old ways, who think weakness can be dressed up as virtue. Better that she dies now cleanly than live to inspire a civil war that would destroy everything." The casual brutality of the statement, the calm calculation that a child's death was an acceptable price for political stability, revealed how far Tormund had traveled from the honorable man Brandr had once known. This wasn't the quick corruption of sudden power, but the slow erosion of principle by expedience, year after year, of small compromises that had led to this moment of absolute betrayal. "You're wrong," Idis said suddenly, her young voice carrying across the pass with surprising strength. "Papa wasn't weak. He was stronger than you because he kept his promises even when it was hard, even when it cost him." Tormund laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Spoken like your father's daughter, he filled your head with the same romantic nonsense that got him killed." He raised his axe and his warriors shifted into attack positions. "I had hoped to make this quick, child. A clean death in the snow, far from witnesses. You could have died believing your uncle still loved you." Brandr stepped protectively in front of Idis, his hand finally closing on his weapon's hilt. The odds were hopeless, 12 against 1 with no cover and nowhere to retreat, but he had faced worse before. And this time, he had something worth. A dying four. "You know me, Tormund," he said quietly. "You know I won't go down easily. Are you prepared to lose half your men to kill one child?" "I know exactly who you are," Tormund replied. "Brandr the Kinslayer. Brandr One-Eye, the man who burned 3 villages to ash because he couldn't find the raiders who killed his family." His smile turned predatory. "You think I don't know about the innocent people you slaughtered in your grief? You think I don't know about the children who died because of your rage?" The words hit like physical blows, dredging up memories that Brandr had spent 3 years trying to bury, the faces of the innocents he had killed in his mad quest for vengeance. The children who had died because he couldn't tell guilt from innocence through the red haze of his fury. "That's why I know you'll understand," Tormund continued relentlessly. "Sometimes good people have to do terrible things for the greater good. Sometimes the needs of the many outweigh the lives of the few. You've made that choice yourself, old friend. Don't pretend to judge me for making it again." Behind him, Brandr felt Adis's small hand slip into his, warm and trusting despite everything she had heard. She didn't care about his past crimes, didn't judge him for the mistakes that haunted his dreams. To her, he was simply the man who had saved her, the father who had chosen love over safety. That touch, that absolute faith from someone who had every reason to doubt the goodness of the world, gave him strength he hadn't known he possessed. "You're right," Brandr said, straightening to his full height. "I have made terrible choices. I have innocent blood on my hands. But that's exactly why I know the difference between you and me, Tormund." "And what difference is that?" "I learned from my mistakes. You're still making yours." The mountain wind picked up, swirling snow around them like the breath of angry gods. In the distance, an avalanche rumbled, tons of snow and rock cascading down some distant peak, with the sound of the world ending. Tormund raised his axe higher, preparing to signal the attack that would end everything. But his eyes flicked momentarily toward the sound of the avalanche, and in that instant of distraction, Brandr saw their only chance. "Hold tight," he whispered to Adis, and then he was moving. The avalanche Brandr had deliberately triggered roared down the mountainside like the wrath of the gods themselves, a wall of snow and stone that swallowed everything in its path. He had pulled Adis against a sheltered outcropping just seconds before the White Death swept through the pass, separating them from Tormund and his warriors by thousands of tons of debris that would take days to clear. In the aftermath, silence fell like a burial shroud over the transformed landscape. Where moments before there had been a clear path toward Clan Ericsson's settlement, now only a field of broken snow and scattered boulders marked where the avalanche had spent its fury. "Are you hurt?" Brandr asked, checking Adis for injuries. While his own ears still rang from the deafening roar, she shook her head, though her face was pale with shock and her small body trembled against his side. The wooden doll, her constant companion through all their trials, lay half buried in the snow nearby, and she scrambled to retrieve it with desperate urgency. "I thought we were going to die," she whispered, clutching the carved figure to her. "Our chest." "So did I." Brandr helped her to her feet, his own legs unsteady from the narrow escape. "But we're alive, and that gives us options." He studied their surroundings with a tactician's eye, cataloguing assets and obstacles. The avalanche had blocked the main pass, but it had also revealed a secondary route, a steep, narrow ledge that switchbacked up the mountain face toward what looked like a hidden valley. It would be treacherous to navigate, especially with a child, but it might lead them to safety. More importantly, it would take Tormund time to find an alternate route around the avalanche. Time they desperately needed. "Can we still reach my mother's people?" Adis asked, following his gaze toward the precarious path. "Maybe, but first we need to get higher, find shelter, and figure out our next move." He shouldered his pack and helped her secure her satchel. "That avalanche bought us time, but Tormund won't give up. He'll find another way around, probably within hours." They began the arduous climb up the narrow ledge, moving carefully over ice-slicked rock while the wind threatened to tear them from the mountain face. Eidis proved remarkably sure-footed for a child, following Brandr's lead with determination that spoke to her noble breeding and careful upbringing. "Tell me about the survival pouch," she said during a brief rest, nodding toward the small leather bag that hung from her belt, a gift Brandr had prepared during their first week together, filled with tools and supplies that could mean the difference between life and death in the wilderness. "Fire steel, dried tinder, fishing line, bone needle, salt, and medical herbs," he recited, checking each item was still secure. "Everything you need to survive on your own if we get separated." "I don't want to be separated from you," Eidis said. "Fiercely, neither do I, but in war we don't always get what we want." He met her eyes seriously. "If something happens to me, you use what I've taught you. You survive, you reach your mother's people, and you make Tormund pay for what he's done." She nodded solemnly, understanding the weight of responsibility he was placing on her young shoulders. Over their weeks together, she had absorbed his lessons in survival, tactics, and the harsh realities of conflict. She was still a child, but she was also Gunnar the Wise's daughter, and that heritage ran deeper than years or experience. The ledge ended at the entrance to a hidden valley, just as Brandr had hoped. Below them, carved into the mountain itself, lay a small settlement that took his breath away. Stone buildings with steep-pitched roofs clustered around a central hall, while smoke rose from carefully tended hearths. Gardens and pastures, protected from the worst weather by the surrounding peaks, showed signs of prosperous habitation. "Mother's Winter Lodge," Eidis breathed, recognition dawning in her voice. "I've heard stories about this place, but I never thought I'd see it." As they descended into the valley, figures emerged from the buildings, tall, fair-haired people dressed in rich furs and fine woolens. Warriors, but also farmers, crafters, and what looked like scholars or priests. The entire community had the feel of a place where learning and martial prowess existed in harmony. An elderly man approached them, his silver beard braided with colored threads that marked him as a person of high rank. His eyes, the same deep brown as Eidis's own, studied her face with growing wonder. "By Thor's hammer," he whispered, "you have Sigrid's eyes. Child, who are you?" Eidis stepped forward with dignity beyond her years, reaching into her satchel to withdraw her mother's pendant. "I am Eidis Gunnarsdottir, daughter of Sigrid Eriksdottir and Jarl Gunnar the Wise. I seek sanctuary with my mother's people." The pendant caught the afternoon light, its silver surface gleaming with undeniable authenticity. Murmurs rippled through the assembled crowd as they recognized both the craftsmanship and the significance of what she carried. "I am Thorvald Eriksson, your mother's cousin," the elderly man said, his voice thick with emotion. "Child, we thought you were dead. Word reached us weeks ago that Gunnar's Hall had been attacked, that you and your father had been killed." "Papa is dead," Eidis said simply. "Uncle Tormund killed him, and tried to kill me too. But Brandr saved me." She gestured toward him with obvious pride and affection. "He protected me through the winter and brought me here safely." Thorvald's attention shifted to Brandr, taking in his scarred face, his weathered gear, and the weapons that marked him. "As a professional warrior, you have our eternal gratitude, Brandr. I'm sorry, I don't know your house name." "No house," Brandr replied. "I am Brandr One-Eye, and I serve no lord but my own conscience." Recognition flickered in Thorvald's eyes, followed by something that might have been concern. "Brandr the Kinslayer? The one they say burned half the eastern settlements?" "The same." Brandr met his gaze steadily, neither proud of his reputation nor ashamed of owning it. "But that was 3 years ago, and I am not the same man who committed those crimes." "He's good now," Eidis said fiercely, stepping protectively closer to Brandr. "He carved me a doll and taught me how to survive and promised to keep me safe. He's not a kinslayer, he's my papa." The simple declaration, delivered with absolute conviction, seemed to settle something in Thorvald's mind. He nodded slowly, then gestured toward the great hall. "Come, you both need food, warmth, and rest, and we need to hear the full story of what happened to Gunnar and how you came to be here." As they walked toward the hall, Brandr felt the weight of curious stares from the community members. Some showed fear at his reputation, others gratitude for protecting their kinswoman, but all seemed to accept Idis's judgment of his character. Inside the hall, they were welcomed with the ritual hospitality that marked true nobility. Hot food, warm clothes, and comfortable seats by the fire were provided without question or condition. Only when their immediate needs had been met did Thorvald begin asking for details of their ordeal. Adis told the story with remarkable composure, from the night attack on her father's hall through their desperate flight to this hidden sanctuary. She spoke of Tormund's betrayal, Brandr's protection, and the skills he had taught her during their weeks together. "Tormund claims he acted to save the clan from Gunnar's weakness," she concluded. "But Papa wasn't weak. He was strong enough to keep his promises even when it was hard." Thorvald listened in growing anger, his weathered hands clenching into fists as the scope of the betrayal became clear. When Idis finished, he was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as if seeking wisdom in its flames. "Your uncle has made a grave error," he said finally. "He may have won control of Gunnar's lands through treachery, but he has also revealed his true nature to those who value honor above expediency." He looked at Idis seriously. "As your mother's kin, we acknowledge your claim to justice. As free warriors who remember the old ways, we offer our swords to see that justice done." "How many men can you muster?" Brandr asked, his tactical mind already working on the problem. 40 seasoned warriors, plus perhaps 20 more from allied households who would answer the call. Thorvald's expression was grim but determined. "Not enough to assault Gunnar's fortress directly, but sufficient for a more subtle approach." "What did you have in mind?" "Tormund rules through fear and the claim that he acted to prevent civil war. But if Idis were to appear publicly, alive and calling for justice, many of Gunnar's former sworn men would remember their true loyalty." Thorvald smiled with predatory anticipation. "Sometimes the mightiest fortress falls not to siege, but to truth spoken at the right moment." Adis looked between the two men, understanding dawning in her intelligent eyes. "You want to challenge him openly. Make him face what he's done in front of everyone." "It's dangerous," Brandr warned. "Tormund won't simply accept defeat. He'll fight, and people will die." "People are already dying under his rule," Thorvald replied. "But yes, it will be dangerous. Are you prepared for that, child? Are you ready to claim your birthright, knowing the cost?" Adis clutched her survival pouch, the tangible symbol of everything Brandr had taught her about strength, courage, and the will to endure. When she looked up, her young face held the resolve of someone who had already paid the price of innocence and found herself stronger for the loss. "I'm ready," she said simply. "Let's bring my uncle to justice." Outside, snow began to fall again, but inside the warm hall, plans were taking shape that would shake the foundations of the northern kingdoms. The hunted had become the hunters, and Tormund Ironhand was about to discover that killing your brother's child was easier planned than accomplished. The ancient clan war horn sat heavy in Adis's small hands, its carved bone surface worn smooth by generations of warriors who had blown it to summon allies and proclaim their right to rule. Thorvald had presented it to her that morning with ceremony befitting its significance. This was no mere instrument, but a symbol of legitimate authority that stretched back to the first kings of the north. "When you sound this horn," he had explained, his weathered hands gentle as he showed her how to hold it properly, "every free warrior within 10 leagues will know that a rightful heir calls for justice. Some will answer out of honor, others out of memory of your father's wisdom, but all will understand that the old laws are being invoked." Now they stood on the ridge overlooking her father's hall, the great fortress that had been home to wisdom, and justice now flying Tormund's banner like a wound against the morning sky. Below, the assembled forces of Clan Eriksson waited in perfect battle formation, 40 sworn warriors plus 20 allies, their weapons gleaming and their faces set with the determination of men who fought for something greater than gold or glory. Brandr stood beside Idis, his own weapons checked and ready, but his attention focused entirely on her pale face. She had insisted on wearing her finest clothes for this moment, a blue dress that had belonged to her mother, recovered from the hidden cache of family treasures that Thorvald had maintained since Sigrid's death. Over it, she wore a cloak of white fur that marked her as nobility, and at her throat gleamed the silver pendant that proclaimed her maternal lineage. "Are you certain about this?" he asked quietly, knowing it was too late for doubts, but needing to offer her one final chance. To choose safety over justice. "I've been certain since the night Uncle Tormund killed Papa," she replied, her young voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to do. "This has to end, or he'll keep hurting people forever." Below them, movement stirred around the fortress as Tormund's sentries spotted their approach. Horns began to sound, not the deep, resonant call of the ancient war horn Adis carried, but the harsh, urgent blasts that warned of attack. Men scrambled along the walls, weapons appeared at windows, and the great gates swung shut with the finality of a tomb closing. "He's afraid," Thorvald observed with satisfaction. "See how quickly he seals himself inside. A confident ruler would. Come out to meet challenges openly. Fear makes men dangerous," Brandr warned. "Don't underestimate him because he chooses defense over attack." Adis raised the war horn to her lips, taking a deep breath that seemed to draw strength from the cold mountain air. When she blew, the sound that emerged was nothing like the tentative note they might have expected from a child. Instead, the horn sang with power and authority, its call echoing off the surrounding peaks and rolling across the valley like the voice of ancient kings demanding justice. The effect was immediate and dramatic. From the fortress walls came shouts of recognition and confusion as Tormund's men realized what they were hearing. Many of these warriors had served under Jarl Gunnar, had sworn oaths to protect his family, had believed his daughter was dead. Now that daughter stood before them, alive and calling them to remember their true loyalty. "Again," Thorvald urged, "let every man hear the call clearly." Idis sounded the horn twice more, each blast ringing with increasing confidence. By the third call, she was no longer a frightened child playing with an ancient relic, but a young ruler claiming her birthright with the authority of blood and law. The fortress gates opened suddenly, and a single figure emerged on horseback. Tormund himself, magnificent in his war gear, his iron-grey hair flowing beneath a helm that caught the morning sunlight. He rode slowly up the hill toward their position, his mount's hooves striking sparks from the frozen ground. "Uncle," Adis said when he drew close enough to hear, her voice carrying clearly in the crisp air, "I call you to account for the murder of my father and the attempted murder of his heir." Tormund pulled his horse to a stop just outside sword range, his blue eyes studying the assembled forces with tactical assessment. When his gaze fell on Idis, something flickered across his features, surprise, regret, and perhaps a hint of the love he had once felt for his brother's child. "Little Raven," he said softly, "you should have stayed hidden in the mountains. This won't end the way you hope." "I'm not hiding anymore," Adis replied firmly. "I'm claiming what's mine by right, of birth and law. Stand down, uncle, surrender yourself for judgment, and I promise you'll be treated with the honor due to our blood relationship." Tormund laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Honor? Child, you offer me the honor of a public execution. Do you think I'm fool enough to accept such generosity? I offer you the chance to die with dignity, instead of as a kinslayer and oathbreaker," she shot back, her young voice carrying steel that would have made her father proud. "And if I refuse?" Adis raised the war horn one final time, but instead of blowing it, she spoke words that had been old when her grandfather's grandfather was young. Then I call upon all free warriors who remember justice to help me claim what Tormund Ironhand stole through treachery and murder. I am Eidis Gunnarsdottir, daughter of Sigrid Eriksdottir and rightful heir to these lands. Will you stand with me? The response came not from Clan Ericsson's warriors, but from within the fortress itself. Voices rose from the walls, first one, then dozens, as Gunnar's former sworn men began to shout their allegiance to his daughter. Eidis! Eidis! Gunnar's blood! Justice for the wise king! Tormund's face went pale as he realized that his greatest fear was coming to pass. The daughter he had tried to murder was destroying his authority simply by existing, by standing before his men and reminding them of oaths they had thought buried with her father. So be it, he said grimly, turning his horse back toward the fortress. But know this, little raven, I won't die quietly. If you want justice, you'll have to take it from my cold hands. As he rode away, the gates of the fortress erupted in chaos, with some men trying to keep them closed, while others fought to open them for their rightful lady. Brandr's father's shield bore the scars of a dozen battles, its iron boss dented by weapons that had sought to find the heart beneath it. The painted wolf's head on its surface had faded over the years, but the strength of the oak and iron remained undiminished. As Brandr raised it to deflect Tormund's crushing blow, he felt the weight of his entire lineage, generations of warriors, who had stood between evil and innocence, who had chosen honor over survival when the moment demanded it. The two men circled each other in the great hall of Jarl Gunnar's fortress, their weapons gleaming in the light of torches held by a crowd of warriors who had once been brothers in arms. The civil uprising Eidis had sparked had succeeded beyond their wildest hopes. The fortress gates had been opened from within, and most of Gunnar's former sworn men had declared for his daughter the moment they laid eyes on her. But Tormund had not surrendered quietly. Instead, he had challenged Brandr to single combat, invoking the ancient laws that gave a kinslayer's accuser the right to face him in trial by battle. It was a calculated move. Tormund knew his reputation as a warrior was legendary, while Brandr's years of exile might have dulled his edge. "You were always the better tactician," Tormund said as their weapons clashed again, his axe seeking gaps in Brandr's defense with professional skill. "But I was always the better warrior. That hasn't changed." "Neither has your arrogance," Brandr replied, using his shield to turn aside a blow that would have split his skull. "You still think strength alone determines the outcome of a fight." They separated, breathing hard, sweat gleaming on their faces despite the winter cold that seeped through the hall's windows. Around them, the watching warriors maintained absolute silence. This was more than a duel. It was a judgment being rendered by iron and blood. From her place of honor at the high table, Eidis watched with eyes that held both fear and determination. She wore her father's circlet now, a simple band of silver that marked her as the rightful ruler of these lands. Beside her sat Thorvald and the other clan leaders who had acknowledged her claim, but her attention remained fixed on the two men, fighting for her right to rule. "Look at her, Tormund," Brandr said during a brief pause in their combat. "Look at what you tried to destroy. She's everything Gunnar hoped she would become. Wise, brave, just. The people already love her more than they ever feared you." Tormund's eyes flicked toward the high table, and for just a moment his expression softened with what might have been regret. "She could have been my daughter too," he said quietly, "if she had been willing to forget the past, to accept that. I acted for the good of the realm." "You killed her father in front of her," Brandr said, advancing with renewed purpose. "You ordered her throat cut like a sacrificial animal. Did you really think she would ever forgive that? Did you think anyone would? I thought she would understand necessity," Tormund roared, his axe descending in a blow that rang like thunder against Brandr's shield. "I thought she would choose the future over the past." But even as he spoke, Brandr could see the doubt creeping into his old friend's eyes. The hall around them was filled with men who had chosen Eidis over Tormund the moment they had the chance. The people in the courtyard outside were already chanting her name, celebrating the return of their rightful lady. Whatever justifications Tormund had constructed for his actions, reality was proving them false. She did choose the future, Brandr said, pressing his attack now, driving Tormund back step by step. She chose a future where leaders keep their oaths, where family bonds mean something, where justice isn't sacrificed for convenience. Tormund stumbled, his foot slipping on the rush-strewn floor, and Brandr saw his opening. But instead of delivering the killing blow, he found himself hesitating. This was the man who had stood beside him in a dozen battles, who had saved his life more than once, who had been closer than a brother before ambition poisoned his heart. In that moment of hesitation, Adis spoke from the high table, her young voice carrying clearly through the hall. "Uncle Tormund," she said, rising from her seat with dignity beyond her years, "I offer you one final chance. Yield now, confess your crimes before these witnesses, and I will show you the mercy Papa would have wanted." Tormund straightened, leaning heavily on his axe as he looked at his niece. For a heartbeat, Brandr thought he might actually surrender, might choose redemption over destruction. But then the usurper's pride reasserted itself, and his grip tightened on his weapon. "I yield to no one," he snarled, "least of all to a child who thinks honor is more important than survival." He lunged forward in a final desperate attack, putting all his remaining strength behind a blow meant to end the fight in a single stroke. But Brandr was ready. The shield that had protected his father and his father's father before him turned aside the killing blow, while his sayax found the gap beneath Tormund's raised arm. Tormund Ironhand fell to his knees, his axe clattering to the floor as his lifeblood flowed onto the stones where he had once knelt in loyalty to his brother. With his dying breath, he looked at Adis one last time. You have his eyes," he whispered, "Gunnar's eyes. Perhaps you were right after all." As silence fell over the great hall, Brandr lowered his father's shield and knelt before the high table where Adis sat, with tears streaming down her face. Not tears of victory, but of grief for the uncle she had loved before he became the enemy she had to defeat. "Justice is done, my lady," Brandr said formally. "Your father's death has been avenged, and your birthright is secured." Adis nodded, wiping her eyes before standing to address the assembled warriors. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had earned the right to lead through suffering and courage. Let it be known that Tormund Ironhand died as he lived, proud and unrepentant. But let it also be known that from this day forward, these lands will be ruled by law, not fear, by justice, not expedience, and by the bonds of kinship and honor that make us more than mere beasts fighting over territory. The hall erupted in cheers, but Brandr barely heard them. His eyes were fixed on the young ruler who had learned to balance mercy with justice, strength with compassion, the harsh necessities of leadership with the gentle virtues that made leadership worthwhile. She would be a great queen someday, this child who had called him Papa and taught him to believe in redemption again. Spring arrived like forgiveness, washing away the last traces of the cruelest winter anyone could remember, and bringing with it the promise of new beginnings. The apple trees in the courtyard of Jarl Gunnar's hall, now Jarl Idis's hall, bloomed with such abundance that their white petals drifted like snow across the cobblestones, carpeting the ground where blood had once been spilled in the name of justice. Adis stood at the great window of the hall, watching children play in the courtyard below. Not just the sons and daughters of warriors and craftsmen, but orphans taken in from the surrounding villages, children who had lost their families to the harsh winter or the conflicts that had followed Tormund's brief reign. Under her rule, no child would go without shelter, food, or the chance to learn both letters and blade work, according to their inclination and ability. The new family crest had been carved into the stone above the main hearth just that morning, its design a masterpiece of symbolic significance. The traditional bear of her father's house stood strong at the center, but now it was flanked by the wolf of her mother's clan and protected by a great shield that bore the distinctive design of Brandr's lineage. Three bloodlines united not by conquest or political convenience, but by love, forged in the crucible of shared suffering and triumph. "My lady," came a familiar voice from behind her, rough with affection despite its formal tone. "The noon meal is ready, and your advisor grows tired of waiting for your attention." Adis turned to smile at Brandr, who stood in the doorway, wearing the fine clothes that marked his position as her chief counselor and adopted father. The scarred warrior who had once lived alone in a mountain cabin now served as the kingdom's most trusted voice, the man whose wisdom guided her decisions and whose presence reminded everyone that strength without honor was merely brutality. "My advisor can wait another moment," she said with mock severity. "I was watching the children practice their letters in the courtyard. Young Magnus has finally mastered his runes, and little Astrid—" She paused, still smiling at the memory of the child she had named after her beloved wooden doll. "Little Astrid is already asking when she can learn to use a sword like her Papa Brandr." "She's barely 6 years old," Brandr protested, but his eyes were warm with pride. The orphan girl had attached herself to them both with the fierce devotion of someone who had found family after believing herself alone in the world. "Surely letters and numbers are education enough for now. You taught me to survive when I was 8, Adis pointed out, "and Astrid has more fire in her than I ever did. She reminds me of someone I used to know, a stubborn old warrior who insisted on protecting people whether they wanted protection or not." They walked together toward the great hall, passing through corridors that had been transformed since the dark days of Tormund's rule. Where once there had been fear and whispered conversations, now there was laughter and open discourse. Scholars debated philosophy with warriors. Craftsmen shared tables with nobles, and children who might once have been separated by class distinctions learned together in the great schoolroom that Idis had established in her father's memory. Sajer Noonmeal was indeed waiting, and with it a gathering that would have amazed visitors from other kingdoms. At the high table sat not just Idis and Brandr, but also Thorvald of Clan Eriksson, 3 former enemies who had sworn new oaths after witnessing their new ruler's wisdom, a Irish monk who served as chief scholar, and little Astrid, who insisted on taking her meals with Mama Idis and Papa Brandr, despite the protests of several court officials who thought it unseemly. "Tell us a story, Papa," Astrid demanded between bites of honeyed bread, her dark eyes bright with anticipation. "Tell us about the time you and Mama were trapped in the avalanche." Brandr looked at Adis, who nodded encouragingly. Over the months since peace had been restored, their shared ordeal had become something of a legend among the people. Not just the dramatic events of escape and battle, but the quieter story of how 2 broken souls had healed each other through the simple act of choosing love over fear. "Well," Brandr began, settling into his storyteller's voice, "it was the coldest winter anyone could remember, and we were being chased by very bad men who wanted to hurt your Mama Idis." As he spoke, Idis found her attention drifting to the windows where afternoon sunlight streamed through glass that sparkled like gemstones. Outside, the world was green and growing again, full of the endless possibility that came with each turning of the seasons. The winter that had nearly killed them both had become the foundation for something beautiful, not just their family, but the kingdom they were building together. She thought of her father often, especially during moments like this, when the hall rang with laughter and good fellowship. Gunnar the Wise would have loved to see his daughter ruling with both strength and compassion, would have approved of the changes she had made and the alliances she had forged. Most of all, he would have understood why she had chosen to make Brandr not just her advisor, but her father in truth as well as name. "And that," Brandr concluded his tale, "is how your Mama Idis learned that sometimes the greatest victories come not from fighting, but from knowing when to be brave enough to trust." Little Astrid clapped her hands in delight, then turned to Adis with the serious expression that meant she was thinking deeply about something important. "Mama Adis," she said, "when I grow up, will you teach me to be wise like you and strong like Papa Brandr?" "Oh, little star," Adis replied, reaching over to smooth the child's dark hair. "You're already both of those things. You just need time to grow into them." As the meal continued around them, filled with the comfortable noise of family and community, Adis reflected on the strange paths that had brought them all to this moment. A year ago, she had been a dying child in the snow, while Brandr had been a bitter exile consumed by guilt and loneliness. Now they presided over a kingdom that valued learning as much as martial prowess, that protected the vulnerable instead of exploiting them, that proved every day that gentleness was indeed stronger than force. The wooden doll named Astrid sat in a place of honor on a shelf in Adis's private chambers, a reminder of the winter when everything had changed. But the living Astrid, who called her Mama and made her laugh with her endless questions and fierce hugs, she was the true symbol of what they had built together. A future where children were treasured instead of sacrificed. A present where honor mattered more than convenience. A family forged not by blood alone, but by the conscious choice to love and protect and nurture, no matter the cost. Outside, the apple blossoms continued to fall like blessings, and inside, 3 generations shared. Stories around a table where wisdom had learned to wear the face of love.